A dictator is someone who has absolute power over a society or a people, and Vladimir Putin, be in no doubt, is a dictator.
North Korea is without a doubt the most repressive regime in the world today. It's been able to maintain a system of such high levels of control over their citizens, like in a way we've never really seen before.
Authoritarian rulers in this world, they don't want to leave the power base.
And I think that power, in most cases, starts off with a genuine ideology, no matter how warped that ideology is, and then gradually devolves into just power for power's sake.
There is a bit of breaking news that we want to get to, and that is a major escalation in Russia's incursion into Ukraine with the help of North Korea.
North Korean troops have been sent to Russia's front line with Ukraine in the Kursk region.
It reinforces the deepening relationship between the two countries after North Korea sent thousands of troops
wearing Russian uniforms are now on the march headed towards Ukraine's border.
This is a violation of the UN Security Agreement.
NATO calls on Russia and the DPRK to cease these actions immediately.
Russian President Vladimir Putin watched nuclear training exercises from the Kremlin yesterday.
And also a sign that Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, is desperate.
So this is pretty serious.
The ultimate goal of a dictator is to gain power, and then once you've got power, the goal of the dictator becomes to keep that power. You know, it's like you've won a gold medal, but people are wanting to snatch it away from you all the time, so you've got to keep holding on to the gold medal. It becomes a vicious circle, because in order to maintain power, you've got to get more powerful as you gain more enemies. And to get more powerful, you've got to restrict people's liberties more. So in fact, you get worse and worse. Power corrupts, it feeds on itself, and you end up becoming an evil bastard.
These number of rulers are increasing, unfortunately. I mean, the world is moving in that populist authoritarian direction.
Most dictators start off with good intentions. One thinks of Pinochet in Chile or Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who they might be brutal, they might want to get rid of their opponents, but at the same time, they have a real sort of modernizing goal for their country. And of course, Putin, to some extent, starts out in that kind of a way as well. He has a vision of restoring order in Russia and improving the prosperity after the really difficult sort of economic situation in the 1990s.
The Economist Intelligence Unit has a thing they do every year called the Democracy Index, which ranks countries according to their democracy. And it has 4 categories. It has full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regime, and authoritarian regime. Ukraine is 85th and Russia is 124th. And more to the point, Russia is deemed an authoritarian regime. So Russia is right down out of 180 odd countries. Russia is right down in the bottom category in terms of its commitment or otherwise to democracy.
Are you concerned?
No, I'm not concerned. I think about the people, ordinary people in Russia. And of course, I see the protest groups, and I think about it, what I can to do with all our citizens.
Good evening, and we're coming on the air at this hour with breaking news after the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent. Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine.
The problem that all dictatorships have is how to keep on regenerating, reviving their purpose. You come in and you do whatever it was that you wanted to improve things, but then how do you change? And that's really the difference between a dictatorial kind of a regime and a democratic regime. You know, the great advantage of democracy is that there's a means whereby countries can change peacefully, change without a revolution. But the problem is with dictatorships that there's no kind of internal mechanism for change. So things which might have worked early on work increasingly less well later on. But there's no succession mechanism. There's no way in which the country can change direction without either a palace coup or an assassination or, of course, the dictator dying.
For a dictator like Putin, what power means is having the ability to do whatever you feel like a kind of medieval king, or indeed, in Russia, of course, a czar, and you know, press a button and things just happen. There's no one argues against you. You have millions of people under your direct control, and they just have to go along with what you are saying. So the hallmarks of your average dictator, and all these Putin has in spades, are narcissism. You've got to love yourself. Yeah, because you think you're worthy of this power.
A ruthlessness, certainly a ruthlessness.
You've also got to be very insecure, because let's face it, the average person, you know, who actually wants all this power is probably missing something in their psychological makeup.
A commitment to power above almost everything else. A total mistrust of almost anybody and everything.
You've also got to be incredibly selfish. You've also got to try not to care what people think about you, although many dictators do have very thin skins indeed. You've also got to have the most enormous ego to actually believe that you deserve this power.
A willingness to go down the sort of personality cult route, especially. And again, you saw that with Stalin, you saw that with Hitler, you see that with Putin, and you certainly see that with the 3 generations of the Kim family in North Korea. That it's all about the person in charge, the office and the incumbent become as one.
You've also got to be brilliant at managing the message. That is a very smart way of saying lying all the time to everybody. You've also got to have a lot of people who are loyal to you, who have helped you on the way up, and you've got to keep them loyal. And also, with those same people, you've also got to divide them. And what you want all those people to be doing beneath you is to be fighting each other rather than fighting you. This is what Putin does. This is what Hitler did. This is what Stalin did. It is dictator textbook tactics.
Vladimir Putin exercises significant control over Russia, guiding the nation with a keen focus on reasserting its global influence and countering Western dominance, particularly in light of the isolation imposed by the war in Ukraine. This ambition has prompted Putin to cultivate closer ties with North Korea, where Kim Jong-un similarly wields strict authority, emphasizing military power and regime stability in the face of international sanctions. Their partnership has deepened as Russia seeks arms and support from its ally. However, despite their shared authoritarian tendencies, North Korea operates under an exceptionally different totalitarian regime. So to fully comprehend this evolving alliance and the nature of their dictatorships, we must examine the histories of both countries.
And 60% of Hiroshima is wiped off the earth. Terrific climax to almost 4 years of Pacific struggle. So with Russia, Britain, and China, and the new power of the atomic bomb, all-out pressure on the Japanese Empire in its last hour of life.
The period of Japanese colonialism of Korea was incredibly brutal. The Japanese really wanted to completely erase Korean culture, Korean names, the Korean language. And so this period was very repressive, and you saw a lot of anti-imperial movements forming. After Japan was defeated, both the Soviet Union and the US were fighting to ensure some sort of sphere of influence over Korea.
Korea was a victim of the beginning of the Cold War. And if you think about the timing of this, the Second World War ends in 1945. It's the surrender of Japan, which then leads to Korea, in theory, gaining its freedom and independence from Japanese colonial rule. But immediately it's occupied by the two superpowers, new superpowers of the time. And immediately it's sort of thrown into the maelstrom of the emerging Cold War.
3, 2, 1.
People usually talk about the Cold War kind of beginning around about 1947, 1948. And it was in 1946, 1947 that the two superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, who were now occupying North and South Korea, it was during that period that they were negotiating what would happen to Korea. And they were both still paying lip service to the idea that Korea would be unified, it would be, free and independent. But in reality, while they were negotiating about this, they were also at the same time setting up friendly client states.
In the South, there was a huge movement for capitalism, for democracy, under the leadership of South Korean leader Syngman Rhee. And in the North, you of course had Kim Il-sung rising to power. He was noted as being an amazing guerrilla fighter, incredibly effective fighting against the Japanese, and he was impressing the Soviets with his communist credentials and his ability as a leader. Kim Il-sung really impressed the Soviets. He was young, he was incredibly smart and savvy, he was really charismatic, he was a great communicator, and he was also a fantastic guerrilla fighter, and he not only impressed the Soviets but impressed many other Koreans. Kim Il-sung was a great admirer of Stalin, and in particular the idea that one man, by using force, could unite a country and could help force modernization and development, industrialization, and so forth. But the war essentially started because Kim attacked the South, and he was able to very quickly move in the army until they captured almost all of the Korean peninsula.
The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world. In view of the world situation, we need to build up our own Army, Navy, and Air Force over and above what is needed in Korea. We need to speed up our work with other countries in strengthening our common defenses.
So it is that on the eve of the 4th of July,
one of the key tactics used by the US throughout the Korean War from 1950 through to 1953 was very heavy aerial bombardment. I mean, effectively, they were using similar kind of tactics that had been used in the Second World War, in the Pacific War against Germany and against Japan, which was carpet bombing of urban areas, of industrial areas, and they used huge amounts of ordnance in North Korea, effectively flattening every urban area. They did also use a lot of firebombing, they used napalm, and there's been a long-standing rumor that they also used bioweapons.
The tactics that were used by the US in the Korean War were incredibly harsh. There were 635,000 tons of bombs that were dropped on North Korea, over 300,000 tons of napalm, and this was even more than what the US had dropped on Japan. So North Korea was almost completely destroyed. All of its industrial base, manufacturing, and so forth was destroyed by the Americans using incredibly harsh tactics. In fact, one of the military leaders, Curtis LeMay, indicated that 20% of the North Korean population had been killed by the U.S.
The most powerful contribution to that crusade was being made in Korea.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We may not now relax our guard nor cease our quest. Throughout the coming months, during the period of prisoner screening and exchange, and during the possibly longer period of the political conference which looks toward the unification of Korea, we and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
After the 1953 agreement, you saw the U.S. replace Japan as North Korea's main enemy. There may be tensions, of course, with the South. Of course, they're competing with one another all the time. Some of it is even petty. But by far, from the North Korean perspective, its biggest enemy is the U.S. And this is something that North Koreans learn from birth, essentially. That the U.S. started the war, that the U.S. was so weak that they sought some sort of armistice, and that the U.S. is constantly threatening North Korea with nuclear weapons. The Korean War actually improved Kim Il-sung's popularity. Even though it ended in an armistice, he was able to sell it as something that was a victory for the North. There was all kinds of propaganda from the moment people woke up till the end of the day. And so this also was part of his image of being this wonderful military leader, something that he spent a great deal of time cultivating from his guerrilla roots, working against the Japanese regime, that he had the prowess, the military expertise to lead North Korea, and he was able to stand up against the Americans.
Over the last 4 decades, communist leader Kim Il-sung has been the object of a slavish personality cult. And this huge stage-managed birthday party was the climax of weeks of preparation. Guests at the jamboree included Chinese President Yang. But all the razzmatazz can't obscure North Korea's international isolation and a pressing need to develop Western trade links.
This is a big feature of 20th century politics, that we see cults of personality all over the place, but they become, particularly prevalent among the Soviet bloc countries. And you get a number of leaders like Kim Il-sung who, as well as copying the policies of Stalin and the kind of developmentalism of Stalin and the surveillance state of Stalin and so on, they also copy that cult of personality around the great leader.
Kim Il-sung was able to transform himself into a godlike figure by essentially creating a religion that was all about him. And this was the personality cult, where there were 40,000 statues that were built just for him, over 3,200 obelisks built, all kinds of monuments, and the personality cult was extensive.
While along those streets, groups of school children don't walk, they march to school. They sing praise to the great leader, chanting, "We are fighters for the ideas of Kim Il-sung."
From the moment that people started, or children started school, they were hearing about how wonderful and great Kim Il-sung was, hearing stories about his military expertise and ability to push out the Americans. This was a relentless form of propaganda, and there wasn't any access to any kind of outside information that would contradict this. So all the North Koreans really heard about was that he was their god, that he was the person that they needed to worship, and that it was really only this type of individual that had this type of knowledge that could save them from eternal misery. And upon hearing this day in, day out, you saw North Koreans became brainwashed by this and developed a type of respect and adoration towards Kim Il-sung that you might only see towards some sort of religious figure.
I think on one level we can say that people were profoundly shocked, right? I mean, this is someone who had been built up, as you say, as a kind of like a godlike figure, had permeated every aspect of people's lives, right? Always in the newspaper, always on the TV. Everywhere you go, there's something to do with the leader. There are pictures up on the walls of all buildings, more or less. So when someone who permeates people's daily lives so much, whether they like him or dislike him, love him or hate him, when someone permeates people's lives so much and then they go and they die, they disappear, I think that's a profoundly, shocking moment in people's lives.
While the outpouring of grief was essentially something that you could say was actually genuine for many people, there was also the fear factor involved, that you almost wanted to compete against your neighbor, to appear to be grieving more. And so when you see images of the outpouring of grief, of people screaming and crying and on bended knee as if they can't survive, this is really about showmanship. It's about proving to others, to the regime, to the authorities, that they were the most loyal to Kim Il-sung.
Putin was one of those, frankly, slightly strange kids, being no doubt about it. He wasn't the kind of, jolly, gregarious, socially confident young man. This was a young man, a young boy, who actually knocks on the door of his local KGB office in St. Petersburg and says, "Can I have a job, please?" And they say to Putin, "Off you go." And Putin says, "Okay, well, what shall I go and do?" And they say, "Well, I don't know, go and study law." So dutifully, Putin pops around to St. Petersburg University and gets himself a law degree.
In the Soviet Union at that time, a law degree did not mean that you would go and become a solicitor or a barrister as you would here. I mean, law was fundamentally an arm of the state, a politicized arm of the state. So law was a pretty good introduction into being a KGB agent.
Then comes back to the KGB and says, "Can I join you now?" And they go, "Yeah, all right."
They were called the sword and shield of the revolution. They were warriors for and defenders of the system, and he took great pride in that. So I think a combination of KGB and Leningrad has really shaped him.
But then he goes on to training school, and it's always been his ambition to work abroad, and especially work in the West. This is why he said he wanted to become a KGB agent in the first place. He's inspired by this film that the KGB had made in the 1960s called The Sword and the Shield.
У нас никому не отнять.
Kind of like the Soviet James Bond, the kind of secret agent who's placed in Nazi Germany, pretends to be a Nazi officer, and sending all the information back to the Soviet Union and defending the motherland, as it were. And so Putin says this is why he wants to become a secret policeman. I mean, one person can make so much difference to the glory of the country, as it were.
Orwell's view of the thought police was not a million miles away from the Soviet Union. People got taken away for what we would regard as no reason whatsoever, and that had been the case all the way through. Being secretive is second nature to Putin, especially as a spy. You give away as little as you have to, and even then reluctantly. He was brought up very much within the folds of the system. His His grandfather had been a cook for both Lenin and Stalin.
He catered one of the dachas, the country cottages, which was available for members of the Soviet elite. And so we don't know very much about him, but clearly his grandfather was very much somebody who was part of the establishment. You know, you would imagine that Lenin and Stalin would have been fairly careful about who was cooking their foods.
His father had worked for the NKVD, which were the forerunners of the KGB, the secret police. They came after the Cheka, and now the KGB are the FSB. Different names, same bunch of guys. During the Second World War, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, he was part of the NKVD's destruction battalions, and they were basically responsible for maintaining order, among other things. So they were just as savage towards their own people as they were towards the Nazis.
His father was evidently given a mission to locate himself behind enemy lines and disrupt the enemy in whatever ways. So it's a very risky mission and almost a suicide mission. I think only 4 of the 30 or so in his father's battalion actually ended up surviving. His unit was ambushed and he survives by lying underwater in a bog with a reed sticking out to the water. I mean, we've no idea whether it's true or whether it's just kind of apocryphal. Well, when we're trying to speculate as to why young Vladimir wants to go and become a secret policeman, certainly his father's wartime history seems to be part of it.
But all this period probably taught him that KGB's effectivity is the ideal style system for the Russian bureaucracy. That's why when he put people in places, he always looked for someone he knows from the KGB background or from the intelligence background in the Russian system.
His 3 closest confidants right now, they all date back to the 70s. They all worked with him as KGB agents in Leningrad. So that, you know, that dies hard with Putin. He's very much a man of his place and of his time. These
people were the ones he relies on when he's doing these kind of international interventions in Syria and now in Ukraine.
The thing about Putin, he was good without being great, and therefore you would never have thought, as a young KGB agent, you know, if you lined up a lot of KGB agents in the late 80s and said, in 10 years' time, one of you guys will be president of Russia, you know, he would not have been the one you'd have chosen, not in a million years.
You asked me about 1990 or 91 when I was there. It was a hugely chaotic period economically. I remember there was nothing in the shops. Most of the shops were closed, and every day I was living in a flat in central Moscow. From archives to my flat, I was just walking around, sometimes 2 hours, just to see who is selling what. Just getting a few things from the street, because people were selling one orange here, a little bit of cheese there, some bread. So it was so chaotic. It was almost like a medieval period.
He resigns from the KGB during the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991.
Gorbachev was on holiday in Crimea, and a bunch of hardliners basically tried to arrest what was the disintegration of the Union. They did it totally cat-handedly. Putin gave his loyalty to Anatoly Sobchak, who was his superior in the Leningrad KGB, and Sobchak supported Yeltsin because their view was that Gorbachev was the elected president of the Soviet Union and that any coup against him was unconstitutional. For Putin, the system was more important than any one person. He didn't hold with this kind of action from the putschists.
But actually, there's no evidence that he does resign from the KGB at that time. We certainly haven't got any documents which were like a letter of resignation or anything like that. And there's every reason to suppose actually that he doesn't, and that he remains intimately connected with the KGB. After the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in 1991, he gets a job with the new democratically elected mayor in St. Petersburg. And really, the speculation is that the reason that Sobchak gives him a job is that he wants somebody who has KGB connections as his kind of tough guy, as his guy who can actually be the link person with the security services and the link person with organised crime.
It basically becomes his bag carrier, but what he's doing is he's forging connections by people, you know, in industry, in politics, you know, all around St. Petersburg. Putin is the indispensable grey man. You know, he's not, you know, making speeches. He's not being a politician. He's simply being a functionary. He's being a bureaucrat. But what Putin knows, and what people often know, is that the people at the nexus of power, it's people in the margin, it's people, you know, at the meeting points of power, are the people who actually gain the power, because they're the people who knows, you know, what different people want, and they can manage those relationships. And suddenly, Putin finds himself, you know, at the heart of power in St. Petersburg. He finds himself enriching himself because everything is corrupt. So that is a key part of the Putin narrative, that relationship with Sobchak.
All those pictures of those guys, he's never, you know, he's always the one in the corner at the back, but he's always, obviously, by the same token, watching and absorbing information, and, you know, that sort of, he is the grey man, and yet he was the one who succeeded because obviously he was very smart about where to position himself and whose coattails to follow. And Sobchak was a very good guy to hitch his star to.
Государственным переворотом. Чрезвычайный съезд народных депутатов Союза. А тем временем началась подготовка к защите.
Loyalty is something that he was proud of in himself and values in other people. When Sobchak wasn't re-elected in 1996, Putin was offered a job by his successor and refused, saying, "I'd rather be hanged for loyalty than rewarded for betrayal," which is slightly melodramatic for a government job, but I think is also quite revealing. That again, that comes into the fact that he trusts his old KGB mates from the 70s. Loyalty is a very big thing for him.
Russia in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin was certainly a very chaotic environment. Yeltsin and his government have been trying to create a market economy. Rather than creating a market economy, what they've done is that they've transferred ownership in the most important bits of the Russian economy to a small number of individuals who've become mega rich.
Russia's much more stable now. I mean, that pace of change was unsustainable, and it only happened because you'd gone from an incredibly restricted system to something where, you know, certainly in economic terms, all bets were off. There's no legal system worth the name. Any country's stability is based fundamentally around the rule of law. You know, you can talk about political diversity and political plurality and so on, but without a rule of law that is basically efficient and impartial, nothing happens. And in Russia at that time, there was no rule of law. If you had a disagreement with someone, you sorted it out with violence, because there was no, you know, you couldn't have a business dispute and take it to the court. There were no courts. There was a ton of money floating around, and the money was getting bigger, you know, especially because with the economic reforms, the exchange rates on the international market, the disparity was so huge that, you know, you could buy a barrel of oil for next to nothing in rubles and sell it for a fortune in dollars. They call it the Wild East. Anything went. There's a word for them. They're called dorkadents. They were decadent dorks. They were the kind of dorks who back home would never have, you know, got anywhere. But here they were sort of, you know, there driving around in limousines and beautiful women and, you know, champagne and so on, just because it was that time and place where they could, and it was anarchy. The memories of that time really die hard for lots of Russians, and actually for a lot of Russians, given them the choice between authoritarianism and the anarchy of the Yeltsin years, they'll take authoritarianism. They'll say, you know, we don't want that anymore. You know, freedom is a pretty nebulous concept when there's anarchy around.
Meanwhile, back in North Korea, a new figure was poised to take center stage. Power was passing to the leader's son, and with the father's death, control shifted once again to the nation's second ruler.
Kim Jong-il was definitely an interesting character. He was sadistic. He was very antisocial. He was paranoid. He is neurotic, narcissistic, schizoid, an oddball, eccentric. Different than his father, that he didn't really have that type of charisma, almost never engaged in any kind of public speaking. He liked to spend his time drinking and eating the craziest delicacies that he could find, whether it be dolphins or donkey meat, and drank up to 450,000 pounds worth of cognac per year. So he's definitely a very different type of leader. Kim Jong-il was also really different than his father in terms of his style of leadership. Not only did he lack the charisma and that common touch, but he really centralized power and personalized power into his own hands. So whereas Kim Il-sung would often consult with his elites on matters of what to do and try to seek out other people's advice on things, you saw that Kim Jong-il really relied on no one. Kim Jong-il was born, and immediately there was myth around him. He was born in 1941 in February in Russia because his parents were living in exile, but instead the story was spread that he was born in North Korea in 1942, and that there was a double rainbow that formed after his birth. He wasn't a guerrilla fighter. He didn't have the military expertise and credentials that his father did. But he worked on propaganda, he worked within the party, and he worked to gain the respect of other people within the North Korean regime. And one of the things that was actually important for him consolidating power was by his military-first policy. For any authoritarian regime, the military usually poses some of the biggest threats to any kind of leader. And by ensuring that the military never starved, even in the face of the famine, he could prevent any potential coups to his regime.
It's a secretive Stalinist state claiming to possess several atom bombs. And now North Korea may be about to prove it for the very first time.
Kim Jong-il wanted to pursue nuclear weapons to have more importance on the world stage, which Kim Jong-il thought was important to just gaining any kind of bargaining power vis-a-vis other Western powers.
East German troops took control of the key section of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate early this morning. They stopped the party, but any hopes they had of stopping the West Berliners destroying the wall were soon dashed. As dozens of young men pulled on a rope and chains, the chant went up, Mauer weg, down with the wall. The reply was swift.
Чтобы сказать свое решительное «нет».
There were scenes of jubilation at the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev as men clambered up the roof to remove the red flag.
The end of the Soviet Union in 1991 was an absolute disaster for North Korea. It really showed up the fact that far from being a very, very economically independent country, i.e. what the North Koreans would say, a sort of juche country, North Korea was very dependent on the Soviet Union still. lot of its industry depended on inputs from the Soviet Union. Its energy system depended on subsidized oil coming from the Soviet Union. It found itself in a very, very difficult position in the early 1990s. One of the things it tried to do then was to try to turn to China for imports of fuel, for imports of grain, but that didn't work out very well. China supported them up to a point, but basically did not want to or was not able to replace the Soviet Union as North Korea's great benefactor.
Without Soviet aid, North Korea became really desperate, and you saw that its economy collapsed. Even by 1991, they already had a program in place telling North Koreans that you can only eat 2 meals a day.
그러한 그 정치적 행사에 쓰고 있는 비용이 정확한 추산은 어렵지만 연간 10수억 불 정도가 되는 것 같습니다. 이런 두 가지의 단 몇 퍼센트만 모아서 몇 퍼센트만 전략을 한다면은 북한의 식량난은 상당 부분 해결될 수 있습니다.
So the famine that hit North Korea in the mid-1990s was incredibly devastating. Possibly as many as 4 million people died just due to starvation. There was just a complete collapse of the distribution system, the food distribution system. And this was largely caused by the lack of aid from the Soviet Union. As this aid dropped and as the imports, the energy imports from the Soviet Union dropped, they were no longer able to produce agricultural products and in the way that they had before. You also saw that North Korea was hit really hard by droughts and flooding. And then you saw a complete breakdown of the food distribution system.
As you might expect, the elite based in the capital in Pyongyang, and then of course around the new leader Kim Jong-il and all his sort of family and acolytes, they were not suffering from famine. There's always a class of people and a group of people who don't suffer from that famine. But in North Korean propaganda, the way in which they try to spin the famine was to talk about something called the arduous march. It said that the whole North Korean people were in this together, and it was effectively like fighting the anti-Japanese struggle of the 1930s. And of course they weren't all in it together. People were suffering very differently depending on what class of society they were in, actually also what part of the country they were in as well. The more rural, the more mountainous countries and the East Coast particularly, they were suffering very badly because food was not reaching those areas. Whereas the more urban, the areas, particularly Pyongyang and surroundings and the West Coast, those areas were still getting much better supply of food.
What was actually happening was the elites, the military, and Kim Jong-il and his children were living lives of luxury, continuing to eat delicacies flown in from China and from Western countries, while the average North Korean was starving.
The North Korean famine of the 1990s highlighted the fragility of authoritarian regimes. At the same time, post-Soviet Russia faced its own struggles with economic turmoil and political instability under Boris Yeltsin. As North Korea clung to isolation, Russia sought global reintegration but faltered, creating an opening for Vladimir Putin's rise.
There's an interesting story about how Putin first gets to be prime minister. He's appointed prime minister by Boris Yeltsin at the end of the 1990s. This is really important because Yeltsin is looking for the right successor. Yeltsin is very anxious about leaving office because if he leaves office, he's very worried that people will want to get revenge for various things that happened. What Yeltsin wants is a peaceful retirement, and in order to get a peaceful retirement, he needs to hand over power to somebody who he trusts, And why does he end up settling on Putin? Answer, because Putin manages to deal with a corruption scandal that's very greatly bothering Yeltsin and deal with it in an extremely efficient and ruthless way. This is the so-called Mabitex affair. Russian newspapers publish details of a project to refurbish the Kremlin, which has been given to a Swiss-owned firm, which is owned by a rather dodgy Albanian businessman. And they also publish credit card statements from Yeltsin's daughters, which show that the company which has been given the contract to refurbish the Kremlin has paid hundreds of thousands of dollars onto the credit cards of Yeltsin's daughters. And the Russian prosecutor general announces an investigation into this. So in other words, the clouds of corruption are surrounding Yeltsin. Now Putin at this time is head of the FSB. He decides that he is going to deal with this in the most kind of ruthless, typical KGB style. Film is released and shown on the Russian evening news of the prosecutor general who's investigating the Yeltsin family romping on a bed and in a sauna with two prostitutes. And so, of course, the prosecutor general is humiliated and has to resign, and the story goes away. And so Yeltsin is said to be extremely impressed with how well Putin deals with that. This is the kind of ruthlessness that a leader of Russia needs, and that's the point at which Yeltsin makes Putin prime minister. Now, he's prime minister, but no one's heard of him. I think his poll rating at the time is 2% in the opinion polls. Yeltsin's is about 3 or 4%. Yeltsin is universally hated by this time. So how are they going to turn Putin from 2% in the polls to a credible presidential candidate who can beat the then favourite for the presidency, who's a real enemy of Yeltsin's, who Yeltsin thinks will be returning Russia to the communist past? And how do you do this? Well, you fight a short, victorious war. But Russia isn't at war with anybody, so there's a need to manufacture a war in order to turn Putin into a kind of war leader. First of all, there's an explosion in a Moscow shopping mall, and then a truck bomb blows up outside an army barracks in the Southern Republic of Dagestan. And then there are 3 so-called apartment bombings where apartment blocks are blown up in the middle of the night.
Something like 300 Russian citizens, civilians, were killed in those bombings, and immediately the authorities said they were Chechens. Even before anyone came and did investigation in the place, they said Chechens did this, Chechen terrorists did this. And Putin's response was immediately send the army to Chechnya.
A serious presidential contender, and I don't think that Yeltsin's approval will add much to that zero.
And Putin makes these speeches saying, I will wipe out the terrorists wherever they are, I will find them. If they're in the outhouse, I will rub them out in the outhouse. He's using real kind of mafia slang. He's going to be the big dog who can keep the country safe from these terrorists who are just slaughtering ordinary people. So suddenly, his poll ratings start shooting up. Now, the interesting thing about the apartment bombings is that there's an awful lot of evidence that these were not, in fact, carried out by Chechen terrorists, that, in fact, the apartment bombings were a false flag operation by the FSB. For example, the expertise to blow up buildings in the very precise way that it was done, the explosive which was used to do them, which was only available to the Russian state. There was a failed bombing in the city of Ryazan. The people who planted the explosives were actually caught and turned out to be FSB agents. And then the head of the FSB comes out and says, well, no, that wasn't an attempted bombing at all. That was a training exercise by the FSB. So really, one might say that this is the kind of founding crime of the Putin regime, that actually Putin was prepared from the start to see hundreds of his own people blown up in order to secure his political power.